March 7, 1945, 3:30 p.m., Remagen, Germany. A German captain presses a heavy detonator connected directly to 2,800 kilograms of military-grade explosives wired across the Ludendorff Bridge. The steel should tear apart. The massive stone piers should crumble into the freezing, turbulent waters of the Rhine River below. It does not happen, and Germany's entire Western defense strategy collapses with it in a matter of seconds. In November 2023, an ordinary civil engineering contractor performs a routine soil stabilization task in a remote, overgrown embankment just south of the original Remagen bridgehead. The dull, rhythmic thud of the excavator bucket suddenly grinds against dense, unnatural resistance. They stop the machinery. A hollow, metallic echo resonates through the damp earth, entirely distinct from the sound of striking natural limestone. The crew uncovers a subterranean concrete hatch, sealed shut and buried beneath 80 years of shifting mud and roots. When a specialized forensic history team arrives from Berlin, they uncover a vastly expanded discovery beneath the riverbank. Inside lies a pressurized steel vault dated 1945, and a series of cryptic, heavily encrypted logistical blueprints that suggest the survival of the Ludendorff Bridge was not a miraculous accident of war. It was a calculated, mathematically guaranteed outcome driven by an entirely hidden network. The German military believed they controlled the timeline, but the waterlogged ledgers tell a profoundly different story about the hidden architecture of victory. The survival of the Remagen Bridge has always been framed as a stroke of incredible, unprecedented luck. The actual truth is far more terrifying for the engineers who believed the Rhine was impassable. If you want to see how this story unfolds, hit the like button. How did a civilian mathematician and a secret stockpile of 700,000 modular steel panels predetermine the fall of the Third Reich before a single soldier ever reached the water? Lieutenant Karl Timmerman was 22 years old, leading the vanguard of the American 9th Armored Division. Born in Frankfurt, Germany, just a couple of hours away from the very river he was now tasked with crossing, Timmerman was not a hardened, legendary war hero. He was a deeply exhausted, mud-soaked junior officer who had spent the last several weeks shivering in foxholes, dealing with frostbite, shrinking supply lines, and the overwhelming burden of keeping his depleted unit alive. His reputation among his men was one of quiet, stubborn competence rather than cinematic bravery. He possessed an ordinary, almost bureaucratic face, characterized by dark circles and a perpetual squint developed from staring into the blinding, sleet-filled skies of the European winter. Timmerman simply wanted to finish the miserable job and go home. However, the situation unfolding before him on the afternoon of March 7 was anything but ordinary. The Allied advance had violently slammed into the natural boundary of the Rhine, a sprawling, treacherous waterway that the German High Command confidently believed would stall the invasion for months. The military collapse of the Wehrmacht was accelerating, but they still held the geographic advantage. The German engineering corps had meticulously calculated that even if an enemy secured a bridgehead, constructing a functional crossing capable of supporting 70-ton tanks would require a minimum of 48 hours under ideal conditions. But the conditions were actively hostile, leading them to assume complete safety. They possessed specialized formulas dictating exactly how much weight the muddy banks could bear, and they knew the Americans lacked the traditional heavy machinery to bypass these physical laws. Foreshadowing the impending disaster, early reconnaissance flights by the Luftwaffe had noted anomalous, massive stockpiles of unmarked steel crates deeply hidden in French and Belgian forests. These crates did not match the dimensions of standard ammunition or rations. The German analysts dismissed them as decoy logistics, failing to recognize the specific, interlocking geometry of the metal within. The reality was far more complex and deeply rooted in civilian innovation. A quiet, unassuming British engineer named Donald Bailey had sketched an unconventional, modular bridge design on the back of a discarded envelope years earlier. This system relied entirely on human muscle, standard pins, and pure mathematical tension. The entire Allied engineering strategy had completely shifted to rely on this specific, unproven concept. However, implementing this design required a staggering industrial pivot. Without the knowledge of the Axis powers, 650 disparate factories across Britain and America were secretly converted to manufacture these precise components. They relentlessly churned out 700,000 interchangeable panels, enough to build 200 miles of bridge. The military bureaucracy fiercely protected the existence of this stockpile, embedding the shipping manifests within mundane agricultural and textile records. General Eisenhower's staff began issuing bizarre, highly classified movement orders, prioritizing these steel pins over artillery shells. What they didn't know was, the journey to the western bank of the Rhine was a chaotic, brutal descent into a geographic meat grinder. The official destination for Timmerman's unit was merely to secure the high ground overlooking the town of Sinzig, a routine flanking maneuver meant to pressure the retreating enemy. However, an abrupt, highly classified reroute sent his column aggressively tearing down a muddy, steep ravine directly toward the town of Remagen. The temperature hovered at a miserable 34 degrees Fahrenheit, and the relentless, driving sleet coated the Sherman tanks in a slick, reflective sheen of ice. The roar of the Maybach engines from retreating panzer units echoed like thunder against the basalt cliffs, masking the approach of the American armor. By the time they cleared the final tree line, the staggering 1,069-foot span of the Ludendorff Bridge materialized through the dense fog. The obstacles immediately compounded into a waking nightmare. As Timmerman's men sprinted toward the stone towers, the first of the explosive charges detonated with a concussive shockwave that shattered windows 3 miles away. The smell of pulverized stone and acrid cordite violently flooded the air, choking the advancing infantry, but the structural steel merely groaned. The 2,800 kilograms of explosives had triggered, yet the primary load-bearing trusses held fast. The bridge dropped slightly, shuddering under the immense stress, but it remained connected. The immediate rush across the wooden planks was a terrifying blur of ricocheting machine gun fire and the sickening crack of sniper rounds impacting the iron girders. Timmerman pushed his men forward, traversing the 300 yards of exposed railway ties while watching the dark, freezing water rushing dangerously 60 feet below their boots. They tore the remaining detonation wires from the explosive packets with their bare, bleeding hands, tossing the live primers into the river. The initial arrival on the eastern bank was heavily celebrated, but the actual nightmare was just beginning. The German High Command panicked, instantly realizing the strategic catastrophe. They immediately targeted the fragile, damaged bridge with an unprecedented, apocalyptic barrage of advanced weaponry. Over the next 9 days, the sky above Remagen darkened with the fury of a dying empire. V-2 rockets, descending from the stratosphere at supersonic speeds, slammed into the surrounding hillsides, vaporizing entire city blocks. Arado R-234 jet bombers, moving faster than the American anti-aircraft gunners could physically track, dropped precision munitions into the water, sending geysers of freezing mud hundreds of feet into the air. However, the most terrifying weapon deployed was the Karl Gerät, a monstrous 600 siege mortar capable of firing 2-ton, concrete-piercing shells. Despite this devastating onslaught, the true battle was fought by 28 specific American engineers from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion. They crawled underneath the burning, violently shaking bridge, desperately welding steel plates and replacing shattered beams while the V-2 rockets rained down. The fuel gauges on their portable generators consistently dropped to 10%, threatening to plunge their desperate repair efforts into total darkness. They worked in 12-hour shifts, deafened by the constant explosions, entirely aware that the structure was slowly, mathematically tearing itself apart. The hardship escalated from minor mechanical failures to absolute crisis when the main vertical suspender snapped, dropping the roadway another agonizing 5 inches. They didn't just hold the line, they simultaneously constructed heavy pontoon and treadway bridges parallel to the Ludendorff, utilizing the secretly stockpiled Bailey panels. The German engineers had calculated 48 hours for a crossing. Under the most intense artillery bombardment of the entire war, the American engineers achieved a functional, heavy-load crossing in exactly 9 hours. By the time the original stone and steel bridge finally collapsed into the Rhine 10 days later, over 25,000 Allied troops had already crossed. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the miraculous survival of the bridge and the unprecedented speed of the American engineering response were quickly wrapped in the mythology of divine intervention and sheer American grit. The official narrative was perfectly sanitized, but behind closed doors in Washington and London, highly classified interrogations were already underway. Agents from the newly formed OSS, the precursor to the CIA, quietly began searching for the exact mathematical logs and logistical manifests that had governed the Bailey Bridge deployment. They relentlessly interrogated former quartermasters, asking intensely specific questions about shipping discrepancies and the precise metallurgical composition of the steel pins used at Remagen. Why did the exact number of reinforced panels arrive at the precise coordinates just hours before they were needed? The investigators were highly competent, deeply experienced intelligence officers who recognized the undeniable fingerprints of an advanced, predictive logistical algorithm that predated the era of modern computers. Yet the primary architect of this logistical miracle, a senior civilian logistics planner deeply embedded within the War Department, returned to a perfectly mundane post-war existence. He relocated to a quiet suburb outside of Philadelphia, securing a comfortable, entirely unremarkable job managing a regional railway switching yard. He mowed his lawn on Saturday mornings, attended his daughter's piano recitals, and completely avoided military reunions. To the outside world, he was just another middle manager who had done his part coordinating train schedules. However, a small faction of persistent investigators remained deeply suspicious. They noticed the glaring, deliberate evidence gaps in the National Archives. Entire pages of requisition orders from February 1945 were conspicuously missing. The alteration of specific rail manifests moving through Belgium was mathematically obvious to anyone trained to look for the patterns. As the decades slowly slipped away, the trail went entirely cold. The energetic investigators retired, their obsessive files boxed away in dusty basement archives. The time-passing montage of the Cold War erased the urgency of a World War II logistical anomaly. The civilian planner quietly passed away in 1982 from natural causes, his funeral attended only by close family and a few aging railway colleagues. His house was sold, his personal papers boxed up or thrown away, and the specific formulas he used to outthink the German engineering corps seemed forever lost to time. He never gave an interview, and he never claimed a single medal for his role in accelerating the end of the war. The secret died with him, or so they thought. The modern excavation team that arrived at the Remagen site in November 2023 was equipped with the most advanced ground-penetrating radar and 3D seismic imaging technology available. The team, a joint task force of German university archaeologists and American military historians, slowly breached the 18-inch thick concrete seal of the buried hatch using diamond-tipped industrial saws. The air that escaped was stale, perfectly preserved in the darkness for nearly 8 decades. As they descended into the subterranean structure, they immediately realized this was not a hastily abandoned foxhole. It was a deliberately constructed, climate-controlled archive. Chamber 1 was relatively mundane, designed to look like a standard secondary munitions bunker. It contained rusted canteens, rotting canvas tarps, and the heavily degraded remnants of standard-issue Mauser rifles. It seemed to confirm the initial theory that this was merely a forgotten defensive position. However, a subtle anomaly in the architectural framing of the rear wall caught the attention of the structural engineer on site. The concrete seams did not align with the load-bearing requirements of the surrounding earth. Breaking through this false wall revealed Chamber 2. Chamber 2 abruptly shifted the narrative from military defense to high-level sabotage. Laid out on a long, heavy oak table was the physical, perfectly preserved detonator circuit that the German captain had attempted to use on March 7. Forensic experts carefully dismantled the housing, using micro-cameras to inspect the internal wiring. The revelation was immediate and chilling. The primary firing pin had not jammed due to rust or a lucky artillery strike. It had been meticulously, microscopically filed down by a machinist's tool. Someone inside the German engineering corps had deliberately neutralized the explosive chain months before the American army ever arrived. But the team pushed deeper. Ground-penetrating radar indicated a severe void space directly beneath the oak table. Excavating the floor plates led them into Chamber 3. Here, the walls were lined with waterproof steel filing cabinets. Inside were the missing American logistical logs. Cryptographic experts spent weeks translating the heavily ciphered ledgers. The documents proved that the American quartermasters had not merely reacted to the capture of the bridge. They had mathematically predicted the exact date of its capture based on the structural sabotage, and had pre-routed the 700,000 Bailey panels to that precise location 3 weeks in advance. The entire miracle was a highly coordinated, mathematically scripted event orchestrated between a saboteur and an allied logistical genius. But container number 4 held something that changed. Everything, tucked inside a heavily pressurized, lead-lined cylinder, was a final, startling set of documents. It was a joint correspondence file. The civilian American logistics planner from Philadelphia and the German structural engineer responsible for the Remagen Bridge had been corresponding through neutral Swiss diplomatic backchannels since 1943. They were both members of a pre-war international civil engineering society. They had not orchestrated a military operation. They had engineered a bloodless infrastructural handover, using the language of advanced mathematics to bypass their respective high commands. They had calculated the exact required sabotage and the exact necessary reinforcement materials to ensure the bridge stood just long enough to end the war, effectively saving hundreds of thousands of lives by shortening the conflict by months. The historical significance of this discovery completely shatters the established narrative of the Western Front. For decades, military academies across the globe have taught the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge as the ultimate example of tactical flexibility and frontline initiative. The textbooks champion the idea that rapid, aggressive exploitation of a lucky break is the cornerstone of modern warfare. However, the unearthed documents reveal that the true victory was won in the silent, heavily guarded rooms of logistics and mathematics. This completely reshapes what we thought we knew about the final months of the Third Reich. It proves that the most devastating weapons deployed by the Allies were not just the heavy bombers or the armored divisions, but the invisible, relentless mastery of supply chain integration and secret, cross-border intellectual alliances. This revelation serves as a profound vindication for the handful of dismissed OSS investigators who had ruined their careers in the 1950s trying to prove that the logistics at Remagen were too perfect to be an accident. They were mocked as conspiracy theorists for suggesting that the War Department had foreknowledge of the bridge's survival. The specific manifests found in the buried vault exactly matched the serial numbers the investigators had spent their lives searching for. Furthermore, these documents suggest the existence of a much wider, undocumented escape network of anti-Nazi civil engineers who quietly sabotaged German infrastructure from the inside, ensuring that when the Allied armor arrived, the critical paths were already mathematically cleared. This explains why certain heavily defended railway hubs in the Ruhr Valley mysteriously suffered catastrophic, unexplainable mechanical failures just hours before American bombers arrived. While Hermann Goering famously admitted after the war that the one weapon he never accounted for was the long-range P-51 Mustang fighter, the truth buried in the Remagen bunker suggests an even deeper failure of Axis intelligence. The German High Command fundamentally misunderstood the power of industrial standardization. They believed in the supremacy of complex, over-engineered wonder weapons like the V-2 rocket and the jet bomber. But they were ultimately defeated by a deeply pragmatic, mathematically flawless system of interchangeable steel panels and the quiet, brilliant men who knew exactly where to place them. While historians are currently investigating other surviving WWII bridges in France and Italy for similar signs of coordinated engineering sabotage, the complete extent of this secret society's influence remains an active, fiercely debated subject among modern forensic scholars. Among the cold, calculated blueprints and the stark mathematical formulas found in the final pressurized vault, the excavation team discovered a small, decaying leather satchel. Inside were intensely personal objects that deeply humanized the men behind the machinery. There was a faded, black and white photograph of the American logistics planner and the German structural engineer, standing together in front of a suspension bridge in New York during a 1938 civil engineering conference. Beside the photo was a small handwritten journal belonging to the German engineer. The final entry, dated March 6, 1945, the night before the bridge was taken, was not a declaration of treason or a grand political statement. It simply read, "The mathematics hold, the steel will bear the weight. May God forgive me for the uniform I wear, but tomorrow the river opens." The American civilian planner returned to his railway yard, never speaking of the thousands of lives his calculations had saved. Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, the brave young officer who actually led the physical charge across the shaking, explosive-rigged bridge, did not live to see the true history uncovered. He passed away from illness in 1951 at the incredibly young age of 29, his role forever immortalized in film and literature, yet totally unaware of the secret engineering alliance that had paved his way. When the descendants of the American logistics planner were recently shown the newly discovered documents and the 1938 photograph, their reactions were a mix of profound shock and quiet, bittersweet pride. His granddaughter, standing in the archives in Berlin, gently touched the glass encasing the journal. "He always told us that building bridges was the only honest profession," she stated.